My name is Mary. I am getting old. Please do not neglect me. There's a grand lake in the middle of my town, and its lighted fountain showcases its beauty. My name is Mary. I am getting old. Please do not neglect me. Let's not forget the memories of the families gathering together in the many parks. My name is Mary, and I am getting old. Please do not neglect me. Let's rediscover the beauty. Let's rediscover the history. My name is Mary, and I am still alive. Please feel free to share all my stories. My town is full of memories of long ago. There's so much history never to be forgotten. My name is Mary, and I am alive. Share all my stories. Today, all I need is some tender care, some fresh water, a facelift or two, and then I will be good as new. My name is Mary of Marysville. I am 170 years old. Be kind to me.
Northern California rivers swollen with record amounts of rain.
If you look back in history, about every 10 years there would be a significant flow in Yuba County.
Many of the most devastating floods on record have happened here in Yuba County, in an area impacted by 3 rivers. Reducing this ever-present risk is why the Yuba Water Agency was created in 1959.
So the Water Agency really has been dedicated since its inception in improving flood protection in the county.
This is the story of how an area once among the highest risk for flooding is now one of the best protected in the state.
We can probably start all the way back in the beginning.
During the gold rush, mining debris flowed into riverbeds, which rose so significantly they ended up higher than the city of Marysville. Farmers built the first levees in the 1800s.
And they were adequate for protecting the farms, but not so much for the urban communities.
After the mining debris filled in the rivers, it was a constant fight to be able to keep the water out of Marysville.
The levees were largely mined out of the channel itself or from whatever was available at the time. In this region, there are silts and sands that are very permeable. And so what happens when we have water against them for an extended period of time, they become saturated and they start to melt away, just like if you're heating up a cube of butter.
The 1955 flood devastated nearby Yuba City in Sutter County. 41 people lost their lives. Something had to be done.
The state was working on Orville Dam, and then on the American River, the feds were doing the same thing with Folsom Dam, and nothing was being done on the Yuba River.
County leaders took it upon themselves, voting for bonds to build New Bullard's Bar, Yuba Water's centerpiece for reducing flood risk. However, a planned Marysville Dam was never built, leaving the area without significant flood control it desperately needed. In 1986, a levee break in Linda flooded homes and businesses and devastated the Peachtree Mall. It has never recovered. 1997's massive flood claimed 3 lives and caused more than $300 million in damage.
Having the 1986 flood and the 1997 flood, 11 years apart, that was devastating to the county.
In the wake of 97, Yuba Water is leading the charge, working with local, state, and federal partners to significantly reduce flood risk. Building setback levees on the Bear and Feather Rivers helped bring South Yuba County into 100-year flood protection. Yuba Water is helping to fund improvements to strengthen the Marysville Ring Levee around the city of Marysville. Upgrades in the Goldfields area are the final link to bring South Yuba County into 200-year flood protection.
It's a flood that you would expect on average to see once every 200 years. To put it in perspective, the 1997 flood is the flood of record, and that was approximately a 100-year flood event. So we're designing to a flood event we've never seen.
All told, more than $600 million of investment and nearly 50 miles of levee improvements have reduced risk, helped spur economic development, and greatly reduced flood insurance premiums for the urban areas, which we still recommend keeping. After all, Mother Nature remains unpredictable.
This has been a 50-plus year effort to get to where we are today, and we have more to go.
In the years to come, climate change will likely mean warmer storms and more river runoff. Yuba Water plans to build a secondary spillway at New Bullard's Bar, improving water release capacity, along with a new state partnership to use forecasting data to proactively manage reservoir flows during heavy storms.
Its design is to roughly double the level of flood protection that we would have along the Yuba River.
Today, Yuba County is on track to become the first urban area to meet the state's mandate for 200-year levee protection. Our ultimate goal is 500-year protection for the urban areas in Yuba County, in an area where flooding was once all too common.
We are light years ahead of where we were before the agency was created.
We've significantly improved the levees themselves and reduced the risk of flooding to the community.
We're finally at that tipping point where we're able to move on to the next chapter in Yuba County, which I think will be a bright future.
Gonna build a city right here. Gonna build a city right here. Covala Ramirez and all the rest had vision. Gold to invest, 1850 was the year. And they built a city right here. Gonna need a judge and a mayor. Gonna need a judge and a mayor. Stephen J. Fields swore an oath, got elected, and he became both. Not much of a town yet there, but they had a judge and a mayor. Judge Field, watch your back. There's a man who wants you dead. Tried to sneak up from behind, but a U.S. Marshal shot him dead. He was a wild man of his time. His whipping post was no crime. The little city had no jail. 30 lashes paid your bail, both wild and sublime. He was a wild man of his time. Judge Field, don't look back. The sun is sinking low. Judge Field, eastward ho. It's off to the Supreme Court bench you go. Abe Lincoln said, here's the deal. You're Supreme Court Justice Field. All the land and all the power, right till his appointed hour. A memory comes back clear. Gonna build a city right here. A memory comes back clear. Gonna build a city right here.
I'm so glad you came. I do appreciate so much your interest in my legacy, although I was a bit surprised to discover that you seem less interested in my long and distinguished career on the United States Supreme Court bench and more on my time in California. I'm happily surprised, though. It's just that nobody's spoken to me of Marysville in many years. I got her started, you know. When I landed there in January of 1850, it was nothing but mud and tents and a few hundred people. When I left there in October of 1857, it was a well-built city of about 10,000, one of the largest in California and one of its most important. Several years ago, I dictated some reminiscences of my time in California and had it published just for the benefit of my friends. And I may from time to time during the interview, if my memory escapes me, search this document for the specific revealing details of my story. Oh yes, and we may be interrupted. There's supposed to be a photographer come by and take my last picture as a portrait as a member of the U.S. Supreme Court. I understand he's bringing one of those new cameras that Mr. Eastman developed a few years ago, the box camera that has 100 gel negatives in it. You know, when you're done taking the pictures, you send it back to Mr. Eastman, and in a couple of weeks he sends you your pictures. Pretty soon, you know, you don't have to carry around all those heavy glass plate negatives and all those chemicals. Just about anybody can take a picture anywhere. And the next thing you know, we'll get pictures of people in the parks, in the saloons, and maybe even what they're having for dinner. Anyway, get comfortable. You got your notebook out. Let's begin. We'll start with your first question. How was it that I wound up in California anyway? Well, I'd have to say it's Dudley's fault. In 1846, I was 29 years old and working in my brother David Dudley Field's law firm in New York. And during the course of my employment, and though we didn't discuss it directly, and even though I love my brother very much, we came to the mutual conclusion that New York just wasn't big enough for two attorneys with the last name of Field. You see, he wanted me out of his hair as much as I wanted out from beneath his shadow. Now, several months before the war with Mexico, my brother wrote 2 articles for the Democratic Review on the subject of the northwest boundary of the United States territories and the British possessions. During the course of writing that article, he had an opportunity to review several sources on California and Oregon, and he became quite familiar with both the geography and the political history of the Pacific Coast. A couple months later, when the war began, my brother remarked to me that if he were a young man, he would go to San Francisco, that he believed that we would not have peace until such time as we secured the harbor there. There being no other good harbors in California, and that at some point in the not-too-distant future, San Francisco would be a great city. And he further said that if I went, he would supply the means, not just for transportation, but to purchase property at San Francisco and vicinity. A couple months later, President Polk was agitating for volunteers to go west, and my brother again encouraged me to get involved in that migration. Now, the idea of going to California had made a big impression on my mind. I had, it had a sense of adventure to it, and I'd always thought that the most desirable fame that a man could achieve would be that of a founder of a state, and the more I thought about the lands on the other side of the Sierra Nevada, just about to come into the United States possession, the more I was fascinated by the idea of settling there and growing up with it. But first I wanted to go to Europe, which I did. I quit my brother's employment with the understanding that when I returned to the United States, I would again give California consideration, which is how I wound up in Paris in December '48, when I read in the New York Herald President Polk's message confirming the discovery of gold in California. I can't tell you how this affected my mind. I mean, I read it and I reread it, and then it recurred to me, my brother's impulse to send me there, and I was a little regretful that I hadn't followed his suggestion. But, you know, I stayed in Europe and continued on with my path to visit each one of its most important cities. returning to the United States in 1849, arriving in New York on October 1st. Now, there already was at this time in New York several steamships leaving frequently with those bound for California, and each one went full. The impulse began in me by my brother, and agitated more by the president of a message of President Polk, I joined the throng. On November 13th, 1849, I took passage on the sidewheel steamship, the Crescent City. And a week later, I found myself at the mouth of the Chagres River in the Isthmus of Panama, the smallest landmass between the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. The next 2 weeks we spent crossing the isthmus to catch a steamer on the other side. We began in small boats, and we paid some Panamanian natives using long poles to push us up the river for 4 days. The rest of the journey, however, was on the backs of mules through grueling mud, an exotic forest, past the carcasses of several mules and horses that hadn't made previous trips, and then finally over the mountain, and we landed at Panama, where I found a crowd of people in every degree of excitement. Everybody was trying to get to California, but there must have been 10,000 people there. Those of us who had come in the Crescent City, we already held tickets for the second leg of the journey, but such was the demand of the throng at Panama that several of the steerage passengers sold their tickets for $750 apiece, taking a chance that they get on cheaper later. These proved to be very unfortunate transactions because the poor fellows who gave up their tickets not only lost time getting to California, but they exposed themselves to the malaria of a very unhealthy coast. I mean, already at Panama there was much sickness and there would be much death to follow. Those of us who survived were exposed to many hardships before we escaped. Finally, on December 6th, we boarded the new steamship, the California. Now, it was about 10,000 pounds burden, but probably no ship ever carried so many people so far. By the time we left, there seemed to be no room from stem to stern. I understand the ship was rated with a passenger capacity of 250, but I was also told there were 1,250 passengers aboard. Unfortunately, many of them carried the seeds of disease. Aggravated by poor nutrition and the crowded condition of the ship, the infection spread as the voyage progressed. Panama fever in its worst form broke out, and conditions became sad and painful. The deck became littered with those who were sick, and among the sick was the ship's captain. I made myself a nurse and took care of those who I could, including one gentleman who said that but for my actions, he was sure he would have died. 22 days out of Panama, we finally reached San Francisco on December 28th, between the hours of 8 p.m. and 9 p.m., I believe. Upon landing, my baggage consisted of 2 trunks, and I had all of $10 in my pocket. Now, I might have been able to handle 1 trunk, but I certainly couldn't have handled 2, and so I was compelled to spend 7 of my dollars to have my baggage taken to a room in an adobe building on the west side of what we now know as Portsmouth Square. The room was small, about 10 feet by 8 feet, and had a bed in it. For its occupation, the price of $35 a week was charged. 2 of my fellow passengers and I, we engaged it, and I let them have the bed, and I took the floor. I can tell you, I don't think they had much advantage on the score of comfort. Well, I was up early the next morning with my $3, and I hunted up a restaurant, and I purchased the least expensive breakfast I could find. It cost me $2. So a solitary dollar was all that I had left in the world, but I was not in the least bit despondent about my financial condition because it was a beautiful day. It was like an Indian summer day in the East, only finer. There was something exciting and exhilarating in the air that made everybody cheerful and buoyant. I was walking the streets. I ran into many people I knew in New York, and each one was in high spirits. Each one greeted me with things like, "It's a glorious country." "Isn't it a glorious country? Isn't it the most glorious country you've ever seen?" There was something natural and infectious, and pretty soon I became infected with it. And even though I only had $1 to my name and no business whatsoever and didn't know where my next meal was coming from, I found myself greeting everybody I met with, "Isn't it a glorious country?"
Steamship, steamship, take me on my way. I'm going to Coral, California, it's glorious, so they say. Steamship, steamship, $1 to my name. With that I'll make my fortune, with that I'll grow my fame. Judge Field, his story we will tell. Before he took the high road, he raised a little hell.
What did it look like? Well, San Francisco was strange and wild. The hills that sloped away from the bay were filled with all types of buildings. Some just begun and many just started, all of the crudest sort, and most of them just canvas sheds. Every kind of person from every nation under heaven was there, and all wearing their peculiar costumes. Most of them were from the states, and every state sent representatives of every kind they had in their border. Every country of Europe was represented, and there were wanderers without a nation everywhere. There were Sonorans and Chileans and Kanakas from the Sandwich Islands and Chinese from Canton and Hong Kong. Everything they could want: food, lodging, clothing, transportation, mining equipment. It was all dearly sought and obtained at exorbitant cost. But nobody there seemed to be complaining about the prices. News from the East was dearly sought, and newspapers from New York sold for $1 a piece in the streets of San Francisco. I'd brought a bundle of them. I had 64 of them, I think, and I gave them to a fellow passenger, and I told him he could keep half of what he could sell them for. And to my astonishment, 3 days later, he handed me $32. Everything was attained at exorbitant prices. That reminds me of an incident in Marysville later. Before I left New York, I purchased some stationery as I intended to continue my law practice in California. And this stationer suggested that I should purchase some goat skins to wrap the stationery in, as they would be needed to fashion gold bags in California. So on his suggestion, I purchased a dozen of them for $10, I believe. But at Marysville, I was offered an ounce of gold apiece for each skin. And my astonishment almost choked me, because an ounce of gold was taken for $16. At the Mint, you could get $18 or $19 in coin. Oh, I gladly gave up the skins and blessed the hunter who brought the animal down. He fashioned those into bags and sold them for 3 ounces of gold apiece. But I digress. So, San Francisco. Well, so after breakfast, I hit the streets, checking out the novelty of things. And as I was going down Clay Street near Kearney, I believe, my eye was drawn to a large sign with big letters that said, "Jonathan D. Stevenson, Gold Dust, bought and sold there." Hello, this was some good luck, because before I left New York, my brother handed me a note against Colonel Stevenson in the amount of $350 or $400, and suggested that the colonel might have got rich out here, and if that was the case, I should have him pay the note. So I immediately went in to see him, and boy, he greeted me graciously, and we had many similar friends in New York, and we talked about them for a while, and finally he got around to California. He said, "It's a glorious country. I've made $200,000. That was all I could stand. I shook his hand twice and blessed him so much for his good fortune. And I reached in my pocketbook and I took out the note and handed it to him. And boy, I'll never forget how quick his expression changed. Big smiles to one of shock and disgust. And he took the note and he examined it carefully. And he looked at the front and he looked at the back. And then he seemed to look at both sides at once. And finally, he acknowledged that that was his signature and began to calculate the interest. Owed. He paid me $440 in Spanish doubloons, but maybe some of it was in gold dust. At any rate, if it weren't for that lucky incident, I would have been penniless by nightfall. As soon as I had money, I rented a small office at the corner of Montgomery and Clay Streets, and I hung out my shingle as an attorney and counselor at law, and I waited for clients to come. None did, but I really wasn't disappointed. To tell you the truth, I wasn't fit for business. I spent most of my time in the streets and the saloons talking to the miners. I waited eagerly each day for news from the interior of the state, and especially the north part. One day, there was an occurrence that established my future course in California. Before I left New York, I obtained letters of introduction from several people who had come to California before me. Among them was a mercantile firm of Simmons and Hutchinson Company of San Francisco, upon whom I called. They greeted me cordially and inquired about my intentions as to residence and occupation. They said that there was a town called Vernon at the junction of the Feather and Sacramento rivers that would provide good opportunities for a young attorney, and also offered that they had lots for sale there that they would let go very cheaply and on credit, of course, as they were intending to encourage development of the town. They further said they owned a steamship called the McKim that was leaving the following day for Sacramento, and that they offered me a free ticket on it. Accordingly, I took them up on their offer, and the next day, January 12th, 1850, I left San Francisco for Sacramento, where we landed the following day. Now, this was a time of a great flood, and it seemed that the entire northern country was underwater. In fact, when we landed at Sacramento, we had to take the boats to the hotel, but you know, it was odd because none of the flooding seemed to dampen anybody's spirits. They were all in high spirits and all speaking in glowing terms about the prospects in California. I believed each one of them expected a sudden acquisition of fortune. The following day, I boarded the steamship Lawrence, headed for Vernon. There were so many passengers that the captain asked everybody to be quiet and not move around the deck. About 3 or 4 hours out of Sacramento, the captain, all of a sudden, with a lot of energy, began shouting, "Stop her! Stop her!" And with some great difficulty, he avoided a house that was sticking up out of a lake. I asked the captain, "What place is this?" "Vernon," he said. Vernon. The place affording good opportunity for a young lawyer where I was going to purchase lots of lands at a cheap price and on credit. Well, I told the captain, "I think that I won't hang out my shingle here. I'll go on." Well, the next place we stopped was Nicholas. And the following morning, we landed at the junction of the Yuba and Feather rivers at a place that was then called Nye's Ranch. No sooner had we struck the landing than all the passengers, 40 or 50, headed for an adobe building on the banks, which was surrounded with a bunch of tents. Judging from the number of tents, I would say there were 500 to 1,000 people here. Inside the adobe building, there was a table, and on the table was a plot of a town called Yubaville. And a man behind the table was yelling, "Put your names down, gentlemen, all of you who want lots, put your names down." He seemed to be addressing himself to me, so I inquired about the price of the lots. And he said, well, $250 a piece for lots 80 feet by 160 feet. Put your names down, gentlemen, all of you that want lots. Well, I asked him, suppose you sign up for the lots, but then you decide you don't want them. And he says, well, you don't have to take them then, mister, if you don't want to. Put your names down, gentlemen. I took him at his word, and I signed up for 65 lots. Aggravating in all, $16,250. This caused an immediate sensation. I had, as I recall, perhaps $20 left of what Colonel Stevenson had given me in San Francisco. But it was noised about that a great capitalist had come up from Sacramento to invest in the rising town. The consequence was I was waited on and treated with great civility by the proprietors, two of whom were Frenchmen, Mr. Covalade and Mr. Sicard. They were delighted to discover that I also spoke French, and they offered to show me the town. I saw at once that the place was destined to become the depot for the northern mines, and that its beauty and salubrity would render it a pleasant place for residence. In appreciation for his civility and in learning that he spoke English, I provided Mr. Covalade with several of the newspapers I'd brought from New York, and including the November 13th, 1849 edition of the New York Evening Post that had a notice of my departure and good wishes for my success in California. The following day, Mr. Covalade came back to me and said, Mr. Field, are you the attorney in this newspaper? I took the newspaper and pretended to be surprised that the notice was marked, although I had myself drawn a circle around it with a pencil. And then I said, well, apparently, yes, I am, yes. Mr. Covalade said, well, then we need a deed drawn for our property. Well, it turns out that the proprietors had purchased a tract of land on which the town was laid out from one Captain John Sutter, but had not yet acquired a deed of conveyance. I told them that I could prepare the proper deed, and they sent two vaqueros to Hawk Farm, about 6 miles south on the Feather River, to get Captain Sutter. Now, when the captain arrived, the deed was ready, but when it was signed, there was no officer to take the acknowledgement of the grantor, and no office to record the deed any closer than Sacramento. And I remarked that a place with such great prospects where soon there must be a great deal of business done and many transactions in real property ought to have an officer to acknowledge grantors and to record deeds, and also a magistrate to keep the peace and settle disputes. Now, it just happened that a house, the frame of which was brought up on the steamer that very day, had been erected, and Mr. Covalade suggested that we meet at the house that evening and celebrate the signing of the deed and take into consideration the topic of organizing the town. When night came, the house was full. Now, it's true it didn't have a floor, but it had walls and a ceiling, and we improvised seats out of some spare planks. The proprietor sent around to the tents to find something to add cheer to the meeting, and believe it or not, they found 2 baskets of champagne. This was secured and joyously dispersed. After the wine had passed around, I was called upon to give a speech. I began by predicting in glowing colors the prosperity of the town and noted its advantageous location on the Yuba River at the Feather River, that was easily accessible for steamships coming up from Sacramento and San Francisco, and predicting that it must certainly become the depot for the northern mines. I pronounced the gold region lying east of the Feather River and north of the Yuba River the finest in the country. And that I knew that its commerce was going to concentrate right here at the Yuba and Feather Rivers. But, said I, to avail ourselves of these advantages, we're going to have to organize and form a government. And the first thing to do is to elect a magistrate and a town council. Now, my remarks were met with general favor, and the following morning, January 18th, 1850, there was a public meeting of the citizens in front of the Adobe House, and it was resolved that a government would be created and that there would be an election of an Anyamiento, which is a town council, an Alcalde and a second Alcalde, and a marshal. The election was to be conducted that afternoon. Now, an Alcalde is a judicial officer in the Mexican and Spanish form of law, but in California at the time, out of necessity, the Alcalde took it. Great powers. I had modestly whispered to several people at the meeting the night before that several of my friends had suggested that perhaps, maybe I might be the Alcalde. And my nomination followed. Now, I wasn't going to get the position without a fight, however. An opposition candidate arose, and there was a spirited campaign. The main objection lodged against me was that I was a newcomer, that I'd only been in town 3 days. And after all, my opponent had been here twice as long. I beat him, however, by 9 votes.
He convinced him he could lead the way, assured him he knew what he was doing, warned him that without him they'd all fall to rack and ruin. He told them they needed government with a leader both wise and fair. He kissed some babies, shook some hands. Suddenly, he's both judge and mayor.
Following the election, there was a meeting at the Adobe House where people could hear the reading of the official election results. That being done, someone suggested that the town needed a name. So one gentleman rose and suggested the name Yubaville because of its location on the Yuba River, and another man rose and suggested Yuba Field for the very same reason. A third man suggested the name Circumdoro, a Spanish word meaning gold all around. There was a fourth man of apparently kindly domestic affections who reminded us that there was an American lady in the place, a wife of one of the proprietors, and her name was Mary, and that in his opinion, the town ought to be named after her, and he suggested the name of Marysville. Now, no sooner had he made this suggestion that the entire meeting erupted into hurrahs, and every man's hat made a circle around his head, and we christened the new city Marysville without a dissenting voice. Now, the woman after whom the city was named is Mrs. Mary Murphy Covalot, and she was a member of the Donner Party that suffered so frightfully in 1846 and 47.
Here come the wagons coming out west. Book of Mormon close to the vest. Gonna find angels on the white sand. Jesus gonna take us to the promised land. Get all the children, get them in tow. Gotta leave now, get ahead of the snow. You take the low road, we'll take the high. You take the wrong road, you're bound to die. Come on, Lord, carry us through the snow. Come on, Lord, this ain't no way to go. Chewing on our own bones. Lord, won't you carry us? Whoa, won't you carry us home? Feeling starvation till you don't feel. We're going to the angels, but this can't be real. Eating the hide right off the roof. God, if you're out there, give us some proof. I had a reason. What was it now? To find the angels, find them somehow. Out in the sand, bathed by the sun, I had a reason for traveling on. Come on, Lord, carry us through the snow. Come on, Lord, this ain't no way to go. We're chewing on our own bones. Lord, won't you carry us, whoa, won't you carry us home?
Although I had lived 33 years, spoke 3 different languages, and visited several countries on the globe, I didn't know anything about Spanish or Mexican law, and I wasn't about to begin to pretend. All I knew is that the people of Marysville had elected me their magistrate and looked at me for the preservation of peace and the settlement of disputes, and I was intent on not disappointing them. My first trial occurred in the streets. 2 men came up to me, one with a horse, and he said, Alcalde, we both claim this horse, and we want you to decide who gets him. So I charged them an ounce of gold apiece for a civil suit, and then began to examine them as to their claims. Ultimately, I came to a very quick decision and said, it's plain to see, gentlemen, that the horse belongs to this man, and this one must give him up. But, said the man who was going to lose the horse, certainly he doesn't get the bridle, does he? I mean, the bridle belongs to me. And I thought about it for a minute, and then I said, well, actually, the bridle is a different matter. Not long after my election, I left for San Francisco, where I picked up the rest of my belongings. And while I was there, I purchased several frame houses and zinc houses and had them shipped back to Marysville on a steamer. When the frame house was constructed, I set it up as my office. Now, the Ayuntamiento, the town council, they must have had better things to do because they never met. The marshal who was elected wouldn't serve, so I had a new marshal appointed, and I authorized him to deputize as many people as he needed to keep the peace at Marysville and the surrounding region. To fund this police force, I visited the gambling tents. These men had as much interest as anybody else in law and order, and they agreed to a $5 per table per week tax. I conducted many trials, civil and criminal. When a complaint was made by a riverboat captain that a steamboat had nearly run him down and caused him to lose most of his cargo, I immediately ordered the marshal to seize that steamship until such time that the owner or the captain could put up enough security to appear in court. When process was served, the captain appeared, and a trial was conducted, and a judgment rendered and paid, all within 5 hours of the original injury. One morning about 5 o'clock, there was a knock on my window, and a man yelled, Alcalde, Alcalde, there's been a robbery and you are needed. As I was getting dressed, he told me his story. He had gone to bed the night before, placed several pounds of gold dust in a trunk that was unlocked, and during the night, somebody slid open the tent, snuck in, and stole the gold. Now, I asked him if he had any suspects, and he named 2 and gave me such reason for his suspicions that I immediately dictated a warrant for their arrest. They were brought to me, and the gold dust was found on one of them. Well, I called the grand jury, which indicted him, and a petit jury, and assigned counsel to the defendant, and a trial occurred, and he was convicted. all of this took less than half the morning. Well, curiously enough, my problems didn't begin until we had a conviction. Marysville didn't have a jail. And what to do? I mean, if I were to fine him and release him, he'd have been immediately lynched because there was a large crowd out there talking about that very thing. Now, Mayor Geary at San Francisco had told me that if I were to send him my convicts with the price of a ball and chain, that he would put them on a chain gang. But at that point, passage between Marysville and San Francisco was $50, and then you add onto that the price of the deputy to go with the convict, and then the price of the ball and chain. It was just way too much money that Marysville could afford, and just very impractical. There was really just one thing to do, and however repulsive it was, I think it was the only thing that ever saved a man's life. I ordered him to be whipped with 50 lashes. And if he came back to Marysville within 2 years, 50 more. After the sentence was read, he was taken outside and flogged. And he immediately left the region, never to come back.
Judge, we got a gold dust thief, caught him in the act. You gotta hang a gold dust thief, and you know that's a fact. Judge says, fellas, don't be foolish. Listen up now, fellas, shucks. Let's tie him to a whipping post and save us $50. Some folks call me ruthless, a cannon that's real loose. But me, I choose a lashing before I choose a noose.
There's something so humiliating in a public whipping that I've never known a man thus whipped who stayed any longer than he needed to or ever came back. The community's sense of justice was satisfied. There had been no bloodlet and no lynching, but a severe public example had been provided. On another occasion, a man was accused of stealing $1,200 from a woman. He was arrested, brought before me. There was a trial. He was convicted. Now, I still had the same concern about the sentence, but again, there was nothing else to do. So I ordered the man given 50 lashes on 2 consecutive days, unless he gave up the money, in which case he would only receive the 50 lashes. Well, he was, after a sentence, he was immediately marched outside and told to hug a tree. And the marshal began inflicting the punishment, which he withstood without flinching for several blows. But finally, on the 22nd blow, he said, "Oh, God, stop, for God's sake, and I'll tell you where the money is." There was a large crowd gathered, and they followed the marshal and the defendant out to find the money at the location that he said it was. And then he was told to take it back to the woman and apologize to her. Then, of course, the marshal consulted the sentence, which, discovering that he was to receive 50 lashes anyway, marched the wretch back to the tree and gave him the balance due. I had 300 feet of the Yuba River graded to accommodate the landing of steamships. The lots fronting the landing being the most valuable for business, they got the biggest prices, and of course the property owners were complaining to me on account of the squatters that were out there, and they couldn't use the property in front of their business. So I went out and talked to the squatters and gave them a deadline to get out of there, and said I'd use force if necessary, and even call in the troops stationed at Camp Far West. And that was enough. The squatters left, the landing was clear, business resumed as normal. Oh, one morning this woman runs in all excited, wanting a divorce. A couple of minutes later, her husband ran in, and he too wanted release from the bonds of matrimony. discovering that they had children, I convinced them to make peace and kiss. And they walked out of my office arm in arm, promising to never do anything like that again, to the applause of a crowd that had gathered. In this manner, I carried out my concept of the good cadai of the village, the term for which the Spanish word alcalde, my official position, is based. In short, until my authority was superseded by the appointment of judges by the first California legislature, I managed the municipal affairs and kept the peace in Marysville with some success. While there were many people there of high character and culture, there were also several desperate people, gamblers and thieves and cutthroats. But Marysville was as quiet as a New England village. There were no disturbances at night, and no riots, and no lynchings. In fact, it was the model community for peace and respect for law. Now, between my land speculations and the emoluments of my office, I was doing quite fine financially. After having put my name down for 65 lots, the price of land exploded. It grew tenfold. I sold $25,000 worth in about 3 months, and I still had most of my property. At my rents for the zinc houses and the frame house, I was getting $1,000 a month apiece. At one point, I had $14,000 of gold dust in my safe. You could say that I was on a run, but it was not going to last.
I'm the Alcalde, leader of this town. I serve with distinction, but change is coming round. A nemesis has been sent who brings him evil intent. His name is Turner, and he's meant to lose in the end. 'Cause I'm the Alcalde, leader of this town.
My powers as Alcalde were effectively eclipsed in May of 1850 when the California legislature appointed Judge Henry Hahn as the county judge and Judge William Turner as a district judge. When Judge Turner arrived, I sent him several newspapers from New York. He had spent a great deal of time in Texas, and as it proved, to be a man of narrow mind and bitter prejudice. He was particularly prejudiced against New Yorkers. I was told, and I came to the conclusion that it's true, that my sending him these newspapers from New York, especially the New York Evening Post, led him to believe that I was an abolitionist, someone held in abhorrence by those of the South. And whatever the case, he definitely developed a bitter distaste for me. I learned this in his very first week in court. I'd been engaged by Captain Sutter to represent him in a civil matter, and when Judge Turner made a ruling on some preliminary motion, I rose to object to it, and he answered very petulantly. He said, "The court knows the law. If the court's made up its mind, sit down." Well, I wanted to let him know that as a member of the bar of the state of California that I had the right to object to a judge's ruling, that I intended to do so. But every time I opened my mouth, he responded with punishment. First it was a fine of $200, it was a fine of $400, and then $500 and 48 hours confinement. We still didn't have a jail, so I was to be confined to my office. As I was leaving the courtroom from my office, a friend of mine walking with me said, just never mind what the judge said. He's just an old fool. And I said, well, Yeah, really, I think he's just an old jackass. Somebody overheard it. ran back to the courtroom and yelled, Judge Turner, the Alcalde says you're a jackass. Oh, boy. I heard a shout, and I think he was confused about what to do. I don't think he knew whether he wanted to send an officer after me or punish his friend for repeating what I said. So I filed a writ of habeas corpus with Judge Hahn and was immediately released. But that didn't end the matter. An excited crowd had gathered, and they cheered wildly when I exited the courtroom. So I invited them all to the Kovalot House, a public house in Marysville, and told the keeper to dispense the good things of his bar. And accordingly, the champagne was uncorked, and all the Havana boxes were emptied of their most fragrant cigars. A bill of $290 paid the next day settled the account. Yeah. While the boys were enjoying themselves, Judge Turner entered the Kovalot house, and he was perfectly furious, hurling vile epithets at Judge Hahn and pointing his finger at him and said, I'll teach that man that he's an inferior judge. And then he looked at me and the two other attorneys and called us perjured scoundrels who ought to be disbarred from the practice of law. He made similar statements in saloons all over Marysville that night. Well, later that night, Judge Turner was burned in effigy in the public square. Now, I had nothing to do with that, and I didn't approve of it. I didn't know then. I don't know to this day who was involved. But you can be sure that Judge Turner blamed me. I was immediately disbarred, and Judge Hahn was fined and threatened with jail. Well, he wasn't having anything to do with that, though. When the sheriff led a posse into the courtroom, Judge Hahn pulled a revolver and cocked it and aimed it at the sheriff and said, you'd be violating the law if you would arrest a judge in the middle of the court. That cleared the courtroom real quick. Then there being no other business, the judge laid down the revolver and adjourned court. Yeah, well, I appealed my disbarment, but when the ruling came down from the California Supreme Court to reinstate me, Judge Turner ignored it. He wrote a scurrilous address to the public that he published in the Alta California newspaper. Well, I responded with my own sharp and bitter article, in which I informed everybody that Judge Turner was a man of depraved taste and vulgar habits, had an ungovernable temper, was reckless with the truth when his passions were excited, and grossly incompetent, couldn't perform his jobs. Well, unfortunately, the statement was perfectly true. Judge Turner refused to reinstate me, and he went around saying that for me and my friends, he wanted to cut our ears off. Well, this being reported to me by several people, I went to San Francisco and I consulted California Supreme Court Justice Nathaniel Bennett as to what course of action I should take. Judge Bennett said he couldn't advise me on my matter, but if it were him, he'd get a shotgun, stand in the middle of the street, and make sure he got off the first shot. But I said, I could only act in self-defense. Judge Bennett assured me that would be acting in self-defense. Wow. Well, when I came to California, I came with all those notions bred into a youth of New England about matters of violence. If you were insulted, you'd turn away. But I soon discovered that men in California would take great liberties with people who acted that way. That the only way to get along was to hold everyone accountable and resent every trespass upon one's rights. I couldn't follow Judge Bennett's recommendation, but I did purchase 2 revolvers, and I had a sack coat made with pockets in which I could lay the revolvers in and fire from. I began to practice and pretty soon became quite competent at hitting small objects across the street. Object the size of a man I could have hit with no problem. I decided that if I had to give up my liberties, that I had to avoid a man because he threatened me. If I had to cross the street every time I saw him coming, life itself wouldn't be worth living. Also, having determined that I would neither shun him nor seek him, I had a friend send a message to him, and to make sure that it reached him. Tell him from me, I said, that if he attacks me, or if he threatens me in any way, I will kill him. I ran into him all over town, in the saloons and the streets, and every time I saw him, I placed my hands into my pockets and cocked the revolvers for any emergency. I mean, I really felt that my life was grave danger. For a while, the danger had kind of a fascination to it. I wound up going to places where Judge Turner was, places I would never have gone. Every time I got close to him, I stared at him. And anytime he walked by me, I turned and followed him until he had walked far down the street. If I'd acted in any other way, I should have been killed. Excited with drink, and especially around the lawless crowds that heard his threats, it would not have taken much to urge him to action. However, as it turned out, he never bothered me again. And I really believe it had to be that he knew I was armed.
Judge Turner, he don't like me. What a mean old goat. I'm not worried, I got 2 pistols sewed into my coat. Judge Turner knows that if he poses any threat, I will not hesitate to shoot that buzzard dead.
At the same time, I found myself financially ruined. I mean, with the Judge Turner's refusal to reinstate me into practice, and even if he did, his animosity toward me, it would mean I couldn't practice at all. With nothing else to do, I turned to speculations, which failed. In a short time, a much shorter time than it took me to make my money, I lost it all and got involved with debt. Oh, well, I guess the photographer's here. This would be a good time to take a little break. Don't go too far. I'll be back in a bit.
Gold fever spread throughout the nation, and it drew those men like flies. Some sold their souls or found salvation. Some were fools, some were wise. The bitter cold caught the Downer party, and young Mary survived. Charles Covalard made a fortune in gold and made Mary his bride. Stranded in the mountains where her mother died, Mary felt the bitter cold and bore her losses bravely, and she found California gold.
Zachary?
The blizzard snow blanketed the mountains, and not many survived.
Awesome.
And they prayed to God that they could overcome. They surely tried. The rescue party found the few remaining and brought them safely down. She married badly, then she married well, and gave a name to a town. Stranded in the mountains where her mother died, Mary felt the bitter cold, and she bore her losses bravely, and she found California gold. Her family mostly died back there, tragedy that few have known. But she never acted bitterly, and her pain remained her own. She was kind and sweet to everyone, and that spirit lives on still. And although she died so very young, she left us Marysville. Stranded in the mountains where her mother died, Mary felt the bitter cold and bore her losses bravely, and she found California gold. And she found California gold. food next door. Thank you.
Well, good evening. Welcome back. I hope you enjoyed that and everybody had a sugar high to get the high. My name is Sue Sainer Moyers, and I'm currently the president, chairperson of Yuba County Historical Resources Commission, and we are blessed with getting gifts from the community. And 6 months ago, this beautiful portrait of Judge Stephen Johnson Field was presented to us, and we were asked to find a home for it. When Fields made an announcement he was going to be here tonight, Eastman Special delivered this within 2 weeks' time, as you were just told. And so this picture is going to be donated to the people of Yuba County and hung in the Superior Court chambers at the Yuba County Courthouse of Stephen Fields. So take it away.
My knee? Well, yeah, I think I've been dealing with that for a long time. Very painful. I was in my 20s, walking down the street in New York, and I wasn't paying attention to where I was going, and my right knee struck the hood of a wheel of a coal cart. I didn't think it was much of an injury, but it did get infected, and I spent many weeks on my back, crutches, and I walked with a limp my whole time at Marysville, and several years later, I was a pallbearer walking up the street in San Francisco and slipped on a cobble, and since then I've had to rely on a cane. So where was I in my story? You know, it's going, you know, my memory. At least that's what the Chief Justice and 2 others told me 2 years ago when I tried to force them to resign. They said I was senile. I wasn't having any of that. My intent to retire with a record for being the longest serving judge on the United States Supreme Court. When I leave on December 1st of this year, I'll be leaving after 34 years, 6 months, and 11 days. Not that record. Okay, oh yeah, that's right. Mired in debt. Well, you know, despite my financial condition, my friends encouraged me to run for the assembly, which I did, with the expressed intent of reforming the judiciary. Now, the Democrats had already chosen a candidate, so I had to run as an independent. And it was a big county. Big county at the time. I mean, you know, got to remember that it included what is today both Nevada County and Sierra County. And the cost of transportation to the mines was quite a burden, and then you had to add that to all the drinks and cigars you bought once you got there. You know, miners, they don't really care who's in the assembly. They expect to strike rich and leave the state. So you had to leave something behind in yourself to have them remember you. I did win election. Sad, though, that I didn't carry Marysville. Now, I attribute this to an attempt to lynch a man there a couple of weeks before the election, and my involvement in spiriting him down to Sacramento to stand trial, because I didn't want to give him one there. You know, though, if I'd known that my actions there would have cost me any votes, I wouldn't have taken any other course. You know, California's future depends on law and order. So, the legislature met in January of 1851 at San Jose, and the very first bill I authored was one to reform the judiciary. The first thing it did is it prevented local judges from disbarring attorneys and responsibility up to the California Supreme Court. And then the second thing that it did was it created a the 10th judicial district in the state. One up in the very far northwest corner of California, to where Judge Turner was immediately assigned upon the Yeah, well, the legislative session ended in May, and as I turned back toward Marysville, I found myself in a financial sense ruined. I mean, I barely had passage to get back to Marysville. Once I reached the landing in Marysville, I had like all of 18 cents in my pocket, and I had certainly $18,000 worth of debt, collecting interest at a rate of 10% a month. I immediately went to the United States Hotel, kept by my friend Mr. Peck, who knew me in my more substantial financial days, and he agreed to let me have food and lodging on credit for as long as I needed it. Following morning, however, I did go out in search of quarters, and I found a small house, about 30 by 16, and it rented for $80 a month. So I took it, and I got a chair with no back, and it had it for a wash stand, and with a tin basin and a pail and a toothbrush and a piece of soap and a comb and a couple towels, I was outfitted. But on the cot, I placed 2 blankets, and used up the suitcase for my pillow. I had an old pine table and a cane-bottom sofa, and with that and the bills that were passed in the legislature, I hung out my shingle as an attorney and counselor at law. Now, with Turner removed to the far northwest corner of the state, I look forward to having a lucrative law practice, one that would allow me to pay off my debts and perhaps make back some of my money. Which I did. Well, it took a long time. Let's see, between 1851 and the time I left in 1857, I had one of the finest law practices in all of California. Not long after my return to Marysville, some friends suggested that I might run for the state senate. Now, they assured me that I had the Democratic nomination all locked up, but that didn't happen. There was a convention that year. The Democratic convention was at Downeyville over the 4th of July weekend, and several of the delegates who favored me couldn't make the trip to Downeyville, so they sent with me their proxies, which I gave to a friend of mine to cast for me at the appropriate moment. Unfortunately, he'd been bought off by my opponent with the promise for a job for his brother to be the sheriff of Tuolumne County at a salary of $30,000 a year. I was perfectly furious, and I sought out the man on the convention floor and grabbed him and attempted to throw him out the window. When I got halfway out, when I got pulled back, which was fortunate for probably both of us, because there was a 50-foot well shaft right below the window. Yeah, I mentioned that was the 4th of July. The miners up there, where they had a raucous 4th of July celebration. And the following morning, there was quite a disturbance in camp because a woman had shoved a knife into the chest of a man, and the miners had taken her into custody, and they were intent on lynching her from the bridge over the river. Now, this is despite the ample evidence that the woman had been molested the night before by the man, and he had kicked in her door. But, already many times in California, I had intervened in situations like this, and this was to be no different. So I climbed at the top of the barrel so I could get up above the crowd and get their attention, and I said, men of Downeyville, we can't hang a woman. Think. California's been in the Sisterhood of Nations a mere 10 months, but our fame is worldwide. Would Don't you have it roll off the tongue of the whole world that the men of California are cowards and enough to hang a woman? I was waiting for my words to take effect when someone behind me yelled, well, hell with him! And they kicked the barrel and I went flying into the dust. Well, about an hour later, they had given the woman time to change into her best dress. They marched her to the bridge where she walked up and grabbed the noose and put it around her own neck and declared that she would have done the same thing to any man who treated her that way. And she jumped her to death.
We don't hang women, not in this extent. Let our compassion override our hate. But they ignored her, she hung effortlessly. Sad, sad day in Judge Field's history.
Now, when I returned from the assembly, I had given up my revolvers and traded them in for a derringer and a bow. I believe that the knowledge of men that I was armed are improved relations. At any rate, always going to find a problem in the West, and my problem involved yet another judge. Judge William Barber replaced William Turner on the district court, and post his re-election in 1853. And during the campaign, I said some things that upset the judge. At any rate, he challenged me to a duel to the death in a dark room, beginning with revolvers and ending with a bowie knife. Now, I believe that the judge thought that I was a coward and that I wouldn't accept those terms. But I believed him to be the coward, so I did. Immediately, he changed his mind and suggested that perhaps the battle ought to occur outside. On the agreed upon date, I took a private coach to Sutter County, somewhere south of Hawk Farm and north of Nicholas, and with my second, we waited for the arrival of the main stage between Marysville and Sacramento, upon which Judge Barber was expected to arrive. When it finally did, the second got out first, and then Judge Barber exited, and he didn't get very far out of the stagecoach before he yelled, well, I'm a judicial officer, and I can't be part of a duel. Then he mumbled something about being sure that he was going to shoot anybody that threatened him in the street. He climbed back into the stagecoach and went off to Sacramento, leaving his second. We bought him breakfast at Nicholas and then took him back to Marysville. I thought perhaps the matter was over, but a couple days later, while I was gathering kindling outside my office, and my arms were full, Judge Barber walked up behind me and placed a loaded revolver to the back of my head. And I turned around to him and said, shoot, you coward, damn it! There were several people witnessing this, however, so Judge Barber chose to just walk away. And while he never did that, threatened me in that kind of manner again, and sure he was uncomfortable in court. Judge Barber, he ruled against me on any motion, no matter how strong my argument. And the result of that was that several of his rulings were overturned by the California Supreme Court. He, of course, caught on to that and began ruling for me, no matter how flimsy my argument was. And I began to lose cases at the California Supreme Court. This went on for a while before Judge Barber reached out to me, and we agreed not to make any excuses for anything. I sort of settled our dispute over a glass of wine. September of 1857, I was elected by a wide margin to the California Supreme Court. And in October of that year, October 13th, 1857, I packed my stuff at Marysville and moved to Sacramento. As I said before, I still have some regrets over leaving Marysville when I did. It's a location where many great things happened. Law practice, all the experience I had as an Alcalde, and it was here that I became an original founding member of the California Historical Society. And one of the founders of St. John's Episcopal Church. Yes, I had very many members there in Marysville. But the other thing, too, is that as much as I wanted to be a judge, I was going to miss being an attorney, an advocate. Right? The money that comes with it. My last year in Marysville, my law practice generated $44,000. My salary as a Supreme Court justice was going to be $6,000 a year. While at Sacramento, I met and married Miss Virginia Sue Swearingen of San Francisco, and she has followed me to this day just about every mile of my journey on my circuit. And in March of 1863, late in the Civil War, President Abraham Lincoln nominated me, despite the fact that we were of different political parties, to a position on the U.S. Supreme Court bench. I was, 4 days after the nomination, I was unanimously affirmed by the U.S. Senate. When I was sworn in on May 20 of 1863, I became the first Westerner, the first judge from west of Mississippi on the Supreme Court. President Lincoln had specifically sought a Westerner. I had supported his effort to keep the nation together during the war, and I was familiar with the real estate issues in the West, and mining law, and water rights law. And then, of course, the President also benefited from the counsel of my brothers. Dudley had become quite prominent in national politics, and my brother Cyrus, the great capitalist, he laid the first intercontinental cable between the United States and Europe on the floor of the Atlantic Ocean. They both had the president's ear, and so he got some pretty good advice, perhaps, on who we should choose for the seat. Now, at that time, in addition to the calendar at Washington, the Supreme Court justices were expected to write the circuit from the regions where they came. And I was assigned the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeal, which at that point was consisted of California and Oregon. Later it added Nevada and Washington and Idaho, Montana. I was obliged to suffer the cost of the transportation for 9,000 miles of travel in my circuit every year. Now, in 1880, my name was mentioned prominently as a candidate for President of the United States. I'd always been a Democrat and had uniformly acted with the Democratic Party, except, of course, my support of the Lincoln administration during the war to keep the country together. And my friends will tell you that I, perhaps more than anyone, worked to keep California to stay in the Union. So, the Democrats, they told me that I pretty much had the nomination locked up, but kind of like Downeyville, it wasn't going to be that way. The California California delegation of Democrats was opposed to my nomination. I believe this is owing to 3 specific rulings on the Supreme Court. The first involved the question of whether it was proper to cut off the braid of a Chinese man before you threw him in jail. In my ruling in that case, Californians believe that I supported cheap Chinese labor. Another ruling involved, I upheld the land grants, the grants of land that the Mexican government had given to men like John Sutter. Most in the California delegation thought I favored foreigners over the American squatters that wanted to come in and take this property. Then, of course, there was the ruling on the tax on the railroads that I thought was unconstitutional. Of course, the California delegation thought I was a little too friendly with the railroads and capital in particular. In 1884, my name was again mentioned prominently. Candidate for President of the United States. Only this time I wasn't even going to bother. I mean, the hurdles in the California delegation still existed. So I wrote a letter to the newspapers in California, taking my name out of the nomination. No, I just don't even consider it. In that letter, I said that my judicial opinions regarding matters of importance to the state of California, the question of Chinese in the state, and the taxation of railroad property, and the Mexican land grants, had given offense to, I was aware, many people who would have had me ignore the law, the treaties with China and Mexico, and the Constitution. Someday, our good people will realize their error and give me the justice that I'm due. I'm content to wait for their ultimate approval. It must come someday. You know, there have been 2 attempts on my life as a Supreme Court justice. The first was in 1865, and the second one, I'll go back in 1889, and in that case, I was arrested for murder.
Supreme Court Justice, married man, finance is good, life is grand, so I wonder why should it be people are out to murder me.
Well, the first would-be assassin, though anonymous, apparently upset about a ruling I made in a case involving the city of San Francisco, the question of certain lands, whether they did or didn't own. A couple of years after the decision, I received a package by steamship from San Francisco, delivered to this desk right here. It was curiously addressed, but I thought perhaps it might be a present for my wife and her family in San Francisco. And as I was opening up the package, which was about 1.5 inches tall and 3.5 inches by 4 inches rectangular, I got it up with maybe 1/4 inch when it struck me that something wasn't right, and I thought, this must be a torpedo, a bomb. And so I called the clerk of the court, and he came in and he took the package and dumped it in a cup of water, and then he threw it up against the wall of the Senate chambers across the street, and it broke open. And inside there were 12 cartridges, commonly found with revolvers, about 1 inch each, and some sort of paste covered with gunpowder and attached some way with to friction matches and sandpaper and a piece of linen attached to the lid, such that when you opened it up, it was supposed to spark and explode. Well, we took it to the War Department, and they confirmed definitely it was a bomb and that it would have gone off with great effect. It was a close call. Now, the second would-be assassin was an old nemesis of mine from California. Judge David Terry was the Chief Justice of the California Supreme Court when I was elected to the bench in 1857. And he made some comments that made it into the paper suggesting that he was thinking of resigning from the bench rather than serve me. And Mr. Terry, turns out he too spent a great deal of time in Texas, and he too was a narrow-minded president, especially when it came to folks he believed to be an abolitionist. And the greatest example of that was when he actually got in an argument with a real abolitionist by the name of Senator Broderick of California. Terry actually challenged Senator Broderick to a duel and killed him near Oakland. Being against the law to duel in California, Judge Terry was arrested for murder and managed to get out. He did leave the state and later fought for the South in the Civil War, and I hadn't seen him for 3 decades until he represented a woman who claimed to have a secret marriage contract with a gentleman who recently perished, quite a wealthy man, made a lot of money in the silver mines, and she was after his estate. Well, the case worked its way up to the Ninth Circuit, and I ruled that her secret marriage contract was a forgery and demanded that she turn it over to the court. As I was reading the judgment, the one thing you need to understand right now is not only did Judge Terry represent her as a private attorney, but they got married at some point during this time. As I was reading the judgment, and several witnesses in court said Mrs. Terry was fumbling with her clasp or satchel as she was trying to get over and was laying in front of her. And ultimately, she rose up and she said, "Judge Field, you big fuck!" And then she started saying other vile things, and I told her to sit down, and when she did, and I told the marshal to remove her from the court. At which time, Judge Terry, who was a giant of a man, punched the marshal. Well, then he reached inside his jacket and his breast pocket and pulled out a Bowie knife. And then 2 other marshals joined in, and they wrestled the Bowie knife away from Judge Terry and hauled him off to jail. Inside Mrs. Terry's satchel, they found a revolver. She went to jail too. While in jail, they kept making threats against my life. And when they got out of jail and returned back west, they continued to make such threats that they were published in all the newspapers across the United States. Police came to the attention of the Attorney General, who assigned me protection from a federal marshal when I returned to my circuit in the West. Several of my friends said that I had no business going back west that year, but, being a judge on the highest bench, I don't think I could have looked a man in the eye if I let some ruffian keep me from running the circuit. When my wife and I headed west that year, Marshal David Neagle met us at Reno. He suggested I might want to arm myself. But I said, no, sir, I'm not going to arm myself. When the time comes, the judges had to carry weapons in defense of attacks that were the result of their judicial opinions. It was time to dissolve the courts, called government a failure, and let society lapse into chaos and barbarism. I visit many cities in California on this trip, and held court with several of them, and one morning we pulled into Lathrop, south of Stockton, and Marshal Neagle and I, early in the morning, exited for breakfast at a restaurant at the station. While I was eating, I was struck from behind by 2 blows, one to the side of the face, one to the back of the head, and I turned around to see the giant Judge Terry with his arm raised for another blow. Then I heard, "Stop, stop, I'm an officer," and 2 shots. Marshal Neagle, seeing that Judge Terry had reached beneath his coat, where he's known to keep a Bowie knife, fired 2 shots. The first having little effect. Judge Terry fell to the floor, and I watched that as his life left him. And then the marshal hustled me out to the train, going so fast that I had to send somebody back for my hat and kitty. In the train, we could hear the wailing begin. Mrs. Terry accusing us of murdering her husband. Mrs. Terry yelling at the men at the station to enter the train and get the marshal and get the judge and string them up. Fortunately, nobody acted on that request. And the train departed for San Francisco. That night, Mrs. Terry swore out a complaint to a San Joaquin County judge. She accused me of hiring people to kill her husband. The judge issued arrest warrants for the marshal and me. 2 days later, I was visited in San Francisco in an anteroom of the 9th District Court by the sheriff of San Joaquin County. Oh, I remember he was really nervous because he was there to serve a warrant on a sitting member of the United States Supreme Court. But I told him, do your duty, young man. We should all do our duty. I'm ready. I respect your authority. I'm in your custody. No sooner had he made the arrest than the sheriff allowed me to lean on his arm as we entered the courtroom of Judge Lorenzo Sawyer, where I was immediately released on bond. 3 days later, the governor of California convinced the San Joaquin County District Attorney to dismiss all charges against me. But the district attorney refused to dismiss charges against Marshall Neagle. This resulted in a very interesting case that ultimately worked its way up to the United States Supreme Court. I, of course, had to recuse myself from hearing it, but San Joaquin County and the state of California asserted that it was their responsibility to determine whether the actions taken by Marshall Neagle were justified and not the federal government's. Now, the court disagreed and said that no state in the nation is going to have authority over federal officials in the course of their duty. Well, whether it was as Alcalde or whether it was on the U.S. Supreme Court, I feel I've always done my duty with vigor and fairness. I do know for certain that had it not been for my time as Alcalde at Marysville, I never would have made it to the bench of the United States Supreme Court. So, I think it was a pretty lucky thing that Vernon wound up being flooded. I hope that you've learned something in this interview today, and I appreciate your time, but oh man, I gotta call it. Thank you so much.
Your Supreme Court justice speak. All the land and all the power, right till his appointed hour. A memory gonna build a city right here. A memory comes back clear.